the rock iguana, one of the most beautiful animals on this planet, and they can really make you feel like you're living amongst a living, breathing, and gentle dinosaur. My name is Yupari, and I'd like to invite you into this oil painting video. And here we have an image of our wonderful rock iguana that a friend of mine photographed and cut out the background for me just to make the painting process a little bit easier. So I'm going to keep an image of this rock iguana to the top left corner of your screen so you can refer to it as the painting develops. Alright, so let's get started. We're going to be using a piece of Nitram vine charcoal. I believe that's what it's called, Fusain Nitram vine charcoal, sharpened to a fine point. And we're going to be working on a 12 by 12 inch gessoed board. And if you want to know exactly what materials I'll be using, exactly what materials I used for this video, just go ahead and scroll down in the description box below and I'll have all of that information typed up and ready for you. Alright, so as you notice, we're starting off with a very simple, very minimalistic shape. Now, the purpose is that I'm trying to block in the composition. So first things first, what composition do I want? And so I'm thinking that I want the head, as you notice the little triangle at the top, I want the head a little bit further to the top right corner of the square panel. Now remember, this panel is 12 by 12, so you can also think of it as just a 1 foot by 1 foot panel. So notice this little swoop motion that I'm making. Here's the bottom of the belly, I think. So right now I'm just trying to get an idea of where I want the rock iguana to fit. Now I think that the bottom, let's say the bottom is right about there, and over here, let's say that the eye might go around there. Not entirely sure. But here, I think this is where the corner of the little snout is going to be. Now, whether you're drawing a portrait of a human being, a portrait of an animal, it's important to think about the simple shape and keep things as fluid as you possibly can. Notice how we made a little shape there for the eye. That's where I think the eye might fit, but I don't think it's quite where I want it to be yet. So I'm just moving the eye a little bit now to the right in relation to the little mark that I made there for the nostril, for the tiny little nostril that this rock iguana has. And so now you kind of see the simple kind of almost envelope type shape that I'm creating for this rock iguana. And if you like drawing and painting animals as much as I do, you'll know exactly how much fun this is because you're just seeing something emerge right in front of you out of nothing. And not only that, but it also is reminiscent of nature, and in particular reptiles. I really do like reptiles. Not, of course, I love mammals too, all kinds of animals really. And so let's look at the simple subdivision of the shape. So we started off with those larger shapes, and now I'm pretty confident in the placement of the rock iguana on the panel. Now it's just a matter of fine-tuning these tiny little shapes into more specific shapes. Now we're drawing in the bottom portion of the rock iguana's face. And now if you're very into reptiles and you know a lot of fancy terminology with the reptiles, I apologize because I'm not really going to get into the physiology of the reptile. I will talk about the reptile a little bit, but primarily I'm trying to focus on how I'm constructing the drawing. So let's just refer to the parts as, let's say right here, that little mark right there. Let's just say that that's going to be the little chest. And that's going to be the arm. So let's say this is the arm right about there. And we're starting it off with a very simplified line. Not too complicated, not too many little squiggles, just a simple shape. And let's just say that's one part of the arm to the elbow. And then the other part of the arm comes right about here. And the little claws, that the rock iguana has, we're just going to gesture them. So just make them look like a little S shape. Look at this little S shape that we're making. And that's all we're going to do for the placement of it. And then we'll go in and make it more and more specific as we go. Now, another fun thing with animal paintings, animal portraits, reptile drawings is how unique each of their patterns are. You can definitely tell a rock iguana from a green iguana or a green iguana from a blue iguana. And they're so fascinating with all these little shapes. It's really a lot of fun to go in there and draw each and every one of these little corners. And you're going to see when we get into oil paint, we're going to work right on top of this charcoal drawing, and we're going to look at each little pattern, each little shape, one step at a time. And now look at how this little swooping motion goes right around the side of the reptile. Right about here is actually the back legs. So right about there, we're actually going to crop the back legs just so that we focus a little bit more on the head and the arms and the shoulders. And let's get into some of these little spikes that the rock iguana has. It's really cool. They almost look like the spikes you would see on a dinosaur. This is really like a living modern time dinosaur. Very simple little triangular spikes that we're drawing onto the back of the iguana. Now we're going to put some paint on the palette. And so we're going to use Zinc White, Raw Umber, Alizarin Crimson, Cadmium Red, Yellow Ochre, Sap Green, Ultramarine Blue, and Ivory Black. Alright, so now you know the colors of our oil paints, and now I'm going to mix up basically the entire color and value scale that I want to employ on this reptile. Now, this is a strategy that I'm developing right now just to move faster throughout the painting. So now in the middle region, I'm combining my sap green with my alizarin crimson, and I have alizarin crimson permanent on the palette right now. So alizarin crimson permanent and my sap green, combining them in the middle because the middle tones are kind of a little closer to the warmish side. And I'm going to say the word value a lot. And so value is what you're seeing on my palette, basically, which is just how you speak of areas of shapes that are either lighter or darker in relation to one another. So as we're moving down on the value scale, we're also dropping chroma, which means that we're making the colors less bright. So the darker I'm getting, the more grayish brown I'm getting, very neutral gray as we go darker on the value scale. As we approach the middle, the color combinations are a little bit warmer. Notice how I'm even adding the yellow ochre into the middle. Remember that area also had a little bit of alizarin crimson permanent with the sap green. And now we're going to add a little more paint into the lighter region of the colors on the palette. This is very much a gray scale. I'm making a large puddle of gray scale, trying to work out the entire value scheme that I want to place on this rock iguana. And now for the lighter lights, I'm using my ultramarine blue. And the reason I'm using ultramarine blue for the lighter lights is that this is a reptile, and this reptile needs to be with the proper lighting, and the proper lighting involves a type of light that mimics natural light, that mimics daylight, which is also known as UVB light. And UVB light, when you're looking at it in nature, not just taking a picture or a video of it, when you're actually looking at the UVB light, that is the way the UVB light influences the colors that you're seeing in the environment of the reptile. You'll notice that those colors are very kind of closer to the bluish side. So that's why we're going to have some cooler colors as we get lighter on the value scale. And now you'll notice that I used a little bit of raw umber and alizarin crimson to create a red value scale. So we have a reddish value scale that's we're going to actually use for the eyes. Just burnt umber, alizarin crimson, and a little bit of yellow ochre into the mixture for that. Alright, so now the first thing we're going to do with the colors is we're going to apply a little bit of makeup on this reptile. And if you know me and if you've seen my painting videos, you'll know I'm kidding. I'm not actually putting makeup on the eyes. I'm actually looking for the dark accents within the shape of the eye, and I'm going to use a technique that's oftentimes referred to as window shading. So now let's get into a close-up shot, and we're going to keep the rest of the video basically in close-up shot. That's why I showed you how I mixed the colors on the palette first. But shortly we're going to get into close-up, where you will actually see how we develop these value transitions. And so we're going to use a technique that's oftentimes referred to as window shading or top-down shading, which means we're going to look at each little section at a time as a little tiny unit within the large picture. And we're going to develop each and every little shape in that picture with a tiny brush. Now, a lot of times you'll see me start off with a big brush and get all these large values into place, and that can create an image very quickly. But for this rock iguana, I tell you, this rock iguana is probably one of the most intricate models I've ever painted. This rock iguana has a lot of little tiny nuances and little tiny shapes that the human form just doesn't have. And so we're going to go in with a different strategy. We're going to go in with a little tiny brush, and each little section at a time, we're going to study the way that those value transitions exist. So we're going a little bit lighter around the pupil of the eye with a little grayish light. And you'll be able to see all these little things on the photo reference as well, just right there to the top left corner of your screen. And now we're painting in some darker darks and trying to create that little gray ring that's surrounding the pupil. It's a really cool shape that it's making, and I think these animals are really, really, truly prehistoric gems that are still here with us, giving us basically the first-hand experience of what it was like, perhaps even in the time of the dinosaur. Alright, so now with a little more of a coolish gray, we're painting in the other side of this little ring to the side of the eye. And now we're going to go in with those red colors. Remember that red value scale that I mixed on my palette? We're just taking right off of that. And so for the darker darks, we're going to be using the alizarin crimson. Remember, alizarin crimson permanent. And the sap green mixture with a little bit of ivory black for the darker dark accents of the red. And now we're getting lighter and lighter, so we're using a little bit more white and some yellow ochre to offset the kind of pinkish color you get from combining alizarin crimson and white. And remember, the white I'm using is zinc white. You could use any kind of white you'd like to use, really. I just like using transparent white oil paint, and zinc white is transparent white oil paint. Alright, so now we're painting in our first real transition of tone. And the transition of tone is going to be what will create the illusion of form. And so with this painting, we're really trying to get as close to nature as possible, something that looks as realistic as possible. And in order to do that, we really have to study the tonality of the subject that we're looking at. And rock iguanas are amazing for that. They're pretty much like prehistoric underpaintings, almost, really. They almost look like a grisaille. Remember, grisaille is another word for underpainting. And now we're putting in the little specks of highlight. And these little highlights are kind of scattered all around because there's not... remember, we don't have just one single light source on this rock iguana. We have multiple light sources. And so now let's move on to another form. And we're going to be basically rendering one form at a time and studying it individually. Because again, this rock iguana has a lot of information there's a lot of visual information here that we just wouldn't be able to obtain if we were painting with a large brush and very sweeping motions. So that's why we're going in with these smaller brushes. Now you can see how we're starting to apply a light value on top of a dark value, and we're kind of blending a little bit in between. So light value, dark value up against one another, and it's okay if some of the red on the side of the eye gets into the puddle. It's all right. And we're just going to paint right up to the form that we previously painted. So this is the technique we're going to use for the entire painting. We're going to look at each shape at a time. Some shapes are larger than other shapes as individual units, and study them and how they exist in 3 dimensions. And so the areas that are lighter in this shape are lighter because their planes are facing the light a little bit more. But we're also going to talk about local value shifts, because reptiles have a lot of patterns to them, a lot of color changes, value changes that exist just because of the patterns that they have. So not only are we going to be changing the way that the value looks based on structure, but we're also going to be observing the individual little patterns that the reptile has. And so at this point on, at the top of the eyelid, this is very much a form-based value transition. So this is a form-based value transition here, because this is pretty much the same color, but the form, notice how we're painting in a little darker form now. So this darker shape is actually angling away from the light source. And so it's angling away from the light source, and therefore it's receiving less light. And now we're going to be blending in the middle between this little shape here. So I use the word blending to actually indicate softening an edge. So we just blended in the little edge there by applying a value transition first, and then softening the edge in between, creating that 3-dimensional look. Now you can really see how 3-dimensional you can make something look with oil paint in a very small amount of time, with a clear understanding, given you're applying a very clear understanding of what the form is doing in relation to the light source. Pretty fun stuff, isn't it? We're starting to create the illusion of this eye within the eye socket with just a few little spots of paint. And now we're painting in with a lot more vigor that little light on the top of the upper eyelid. And of course, we're going to blend it out a little bit. And remember, I'm going to use the word blending to indicate softening an edge. So I'm not going to blend to create a value transition. I'm going to blend to soften out the value. Look at that. It's almost like spreading butter over top of your toast in the morning. That's kind of the feeling that oil paint has when you're applying a smooth transition of oil paint against or over top of another smooth transition of oil paint. And now we're painting in the dark accent for the basically conjunction of 2 forms. So that is the form directly above the eyelid meeting the form of the eyelid, creating that dark accent. And that's how we're creating this shape of structure. Now we're going to go in with a lighter value, a lighter color. And again, it really has the consistency of applying like a nice little spread of, I can't believe it's not butter, lightly warmed up with your microwave, just a little touch, maybe 4 or 5 seconds in the microwave. Then you spread it over top of your toast. And that's very much the consistency of the oil paint as you apply it onto the surface. Now we're going to add in some lighter lights right on top to create a plane change that is indicating to me that it is in more light. Now we're in the half-tone-ish kind of region with the oil paint. And when I want to thin out the paint, notice how the paint is now a little bit thinner. I actually use a medium to thin out the paint. I don't use mineral spirits to thin out the paint, or at least I try not to. Rather, I use a medium. And the medium that I'm using is it's called Neo-Megilp. And if you want to know exactly what materials I'm using, again, my painting medium will be typed up in the description box for you. And now we're going to add more paint and create a very clean plane change for the bottom eyelid, creating a sharper edge on the bottom of the eyelid by applying more paint in a much more firm manner. Now we're going to do the opposite thing to the corner of the eye. We're going to create a softer transition here and a darker transition. So first we indicated the plane change, and now we're going to add another plane change on top of it and soften as we go. Softening the edges where they need to be soft, sharpening the edges where they need to be sharp. And again, to sharpen an edge, use more paint, more pressure. To soften an edge, just have a lighter touch, basically a feather-like touch. And that's what we're going to do right about here. We're basically going to be patting on the paint. And again, it's very much like handling a little thin spread of butter over top of your toast. Very easy to move around, very easy to spread. And now we're going to be creating another little transition here, but we're going to basically be finished with this form, and we're going to move on in a little while. We're going to move on to the nostril area. So again, let's indicate the plane change. So we went from a light area to a dark area, and now we're going to be basically softening the transition and connecting one area of form to another. And so we're going to connect the plane that we painted to the left, right into the eye socket with a very smooth transition. Remember, first I mixed up the value that I wanted, and then we combined the two forms by softening the edge in between them. And now the colors that I'm using are very much the colors that I mixed up for you. I'm taking right off the palette and recharging it when I need to. Again, the color combinations are not that difficult. Alizarin crimson, sap green, a little bit of yellow ochre, some black and white in the middle tones, and very monochromatic in the darks. The darks are primarily raw umber, white, and ivory black. That's pretty much all I'm using for the darker darks. And for the light, again, just ultramarine blue and the white with a little bit of raw umber. Now then, let's move on to the little nostril here. So let's start off with the dark accent. So our darkest dark was, again, raw umber and a tiny bit of ivory black. And now we're going to be painting in the lighter areas for the nostril. So we just put in a little plane change, very clear plane change, indicated by a light value up against a dark value. Now we're putting in another plane change, which is going to be an even lighter value. So now we have 3 value transitions on the nostril, and we're going to grow from there. It's going to evolve from those little plane changes. And again, with a tiny brush, observing each little form at a time, really trying to hone our focus to create a much more realistic depiction of this rock iguana. So now, as you noticed, we put in a darker shape surrounding the form because it's turning away from the light. And these areas of value change are areas that are describing planes that are angling away from the light. And again, a plane change is nothing more than a change between one flat sheet of space and another flat sheet of space. Notice how we're painting in these little flat sheets. And a flat sheet is just a conceptualization. I'm not telling you that there are actually flat sheets on the iguana, but rather I'm treating each individual brush stroke as a flat sheet of value. And it's through the modulation of these flat sheets of value that we create curves in space and create realistic three-dimensional illusions of curves in space without even the need of having a background. We're actually going to keep the background white because the rock iguana is a little darker and more gray. And to contrast the dark and gray, I'm going to keep that white background so it can really intensify the darker values. Alright, so now you can notice that we're applying some large form modeling around the nostril. So the areas that are approaching the side, basically the profile of the reptile, are darker because they're angling away from the light source. And we've just applied a little bit of the medium. Now you can see how the medium is thinning out the paint. So we use some medium to thin out the paint and pretty much just spread a tone connecting these two forms. So that is connecting the form of the nostril region to the eye. And we're thinning out the paint, and the reason that I'm going to be applying this large passage of color and scrubbing like this is to create a type of texture. And I'm trying to be a little rough with the texture because I'm going to try to let the brush strokes kind of suggest and to help show define little details within this reptile that are just not visible in the photo reference. I do the best that I can with the pictures that I take, but some of the information just in nature just won't be there in the photo reference. And there's a lot of tiny little shapes the closer and closer you get to this reptile. And so what I'm going to do is create rough passages of paint to suggest the texture that the reptile has in nature. And so now we're going to go over that with more of the lighter planes. Notice how we're starting to like squiggle the brush around with lighter value. So now we're starting to kind of cake on the paint to suggest the bits of form and information that are existing in this area that we can't see on a photo reference. But what we can see are these little basically rock type looking scales, almost like if you're looking at a mountain, like the little ridges and edges of a mountain, you see all these little formations, and maybe that's why they call this the rock iguana. But anyway, these look like little tiny rocks, almost like if you're looking at the edge of a mountain. And so we're going to paint in these rock looking formations over top of that rough passage of paint, letting the roughness of the paint suggest the kind of surface quality of the actual lizard itself. And now we started painting in this little dark accent here for the conjunction between two forms. Remember, dark accents are usually created when one form meets another form and blocks in that little area from the light. And so that's what's going on with the mouth. And so the upper region is blocking the light in between the connection of the mouth and the bottom of the jaw. And so that's why we have that dark shape there. As opposed to just thinking of it as a dark line, let's think about it as a conjunction between two forms. And now we're moving our way across the forms. And again, the color combinations are basically the same. So if you're confused at all about what colors I might be using, just go ahead and go back to that portion of this video where I pre-mixed the colors that I was intending to use. And I'm pretty much sticking true to those mixtures. You can tell how very close to monochrome this rock iguana is, but we do have some warmer tones in the middle. Now we're starting to apply more large form modeling and really trying to let the application of the brush strokes give us the surface quality of the actual reptile itself. Remember, these reptiles are they have scales. They have very rough scales, almost rock-looking like textures. Very beautiful animal, and it really, I don't think you can get it with a very soft application. Instead, we're going in there with a loaded brush and pretty much just one shape at a time, painting in and creating the scales, the scaliness of this amazing reptile. And so now we have some darker value changes over here. And now we're going right back to the dark edge of the mouth. So we paint in that dark edge first so we can soften the edges around it according to this dark edge. So let's go ahead and soften that with a little brush stroke right there. Alright, so now let's go back into the lighter planes and just cake on the paint. And this will really give us the three-dimensionality of the surface texture of the reptile. Now we're moving on to the other side now, and we're going to continue that long brush stroke. Probably went a little too far with it, but that's all right. We're going to go back in with the colors, and let's just fix that. And let's just make it a darker shape. A little darker shape right there as the forms are turning away from the light. And so now we're going to approach some of the patterns of the reptile, some of the patterns of the rock iguana. So first, let's paint in the large forms. So let's just paint this entire thing now as just a very simple geometric solid, meaning the areas that are turning away from light are darker, and the areas such as this one that are turning closer to the light are lighter. And again, we're using a lot of paint, and the application of the brush strokes, I'm applying a lot of tiny little brush strokes, if you notice. It's almost like painting fur, kind of like if you imagine painting fur on a bear or something, except the brush strokes are a little bit more dispersed, a little bit more chaotic. And now we're just trying to smoothen out this little transition here, but again, trying to maintain the tonality of that form. And this area is a little bit softer because I'm going to go on top of it. So I'm trying to get the illusion of this form, which we're already getting from those simple value changes, so that we can go over this later with the little spots of light and dark. And so now we're approaching a top plane. And again, this is a beautiful animal. There's so many different little plane changes and so many different little bits of information that I really don't think you can get with a large brush. I really think you need a tiny brush, and you need to spend your time with each individual little shape. And so now we have a plane that's angling away from the light. You can see now how each individual little plane change is giving us the illusion that the three-dimensionality of the rock iguana. Now we're getting into some of the local value changes that I was talking about. So a local value change, you can imagine, say, look at yourself in the mirror and apply some lipstick to your lips, and there you go, local value change. So a local value change occurs when basically the color of the form itself is changing. So these little spikes that we're starting to paint in are lighter. So the local value of these spikes are lighter than these surrounding values. And so that has to be taken into account, because I'm not painting these lighter values because they're closer to the light. Rather, I'm painting these lighter values because those shapes themselves have lighter values. Now we're just going to go ahead and connect this little shape right here to the side of the iguana's head. And this little patch right here is darker, and I think it's actually darker because of the pattern of the iguana, but it's also angling away from the light. So not only is it angling away from the light, but it's also getting darker, which is what's making that dark value change. And let's even make it darker just to push the contrast. So again, we're going to just make it darker. And through the application of a lot of different dispersed tiny little brush strokes, we're going to get the effect of the actual surface texture of the rock iguana itself. And let's paint in some little spots right here, some little shapes, lighter shapes, little tiny light shapes of the scales. And now let's get in and paint in the side of this little shape right here. So this is a little side plane, and we're going to soften it to try to throw it out of focus a little bit to bring more focus towards those spikier areas. And now you can really see each individual value change is really starting to tell the story of the three-dimensionality of this rock iguana. Now we're moving our way down to a different form. So this is a whole new form now. So this is going to be the bottom of the jaw as it moves around closer to the connection between the top and the bottom. So here we're going to just disperse some of the paint using a little bit of a thinner application of paint. So we're using a little bit more of our Neo-Megilp medium. And so what we're going to do is exactly the same kind of thinking, apply the same kind of thinking that we did in the patch of form directly above. So we're painting in a smooth transition of value changes. So notice this little L shape right here is an area that's further away from the light. And now you can see how we're kind of connecting that to the top plane of this region of form. And so now we're creating a very smooth transition. So let's think about it like, imagine you're painting, say, a basketball. You would start off with the roundness of the basketball itself. So this is kind of like the round form of the basketball. And then you would paint the little stripes and the little patterns that the basketball has on top of the little round form. So that's what we're doing here. We're painting the round three-dimensional solid of this form. Now it's not round like a basketball, but we are conceptualizing it as a simple form in three-dimensional space. And now we're going to go in pretty much like the little lines and shapes on a basketball. We're painting in now the texture on top of the three-dimensional smooth shape that we painted initially. So now we're going to go in and apply the surface texture, and it's a very three-dimensional type of mindset where we are constructing first a solid object and then we place the little tinier bits of information directly on top of them, as you can see that we're doing now. And the consistency of the paint, it's a little thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top. So these patches of paint actually have a little bit more Neo-Megilp on them. And you can use any other kind of medium you'd like to. Pretty much linseed oil or any regular type of medium that you can find that thins out the paint can be useful towards applying layers of paint on top of one another. And so now we're going to move to a different little region of form. And so we're going to move to an area that is facing the light a little bit more, meaning that these value transitions are going to be lighter as a whole. But at the same time, the local value of this little patch of form is also lighter. So not only do you have the plane is facing the light a little bit more, but you can also tell on the photo reference that this little pattern of light is actually a region on the rock iguana itself that is inherently a lighter patch. So that all that means is that this area is going to be really light. It's going to be really light. But the form, we can conceptualize the form as being very round. This is probably the most rounded area of the iguana. And so to create a very smooth, round looking form, we want to know exactly how fast the form is turning. And so it's actually very subtle closer to the top, meaning that the form is not turning so drastically. But as we approach the endings of the form, so right about here, as we are getting closer and closer towards the bottom of this form, you're going to see a very steep change in value. Notice we're already starting to apply that transition. So a fast curve is something that is extremely curvy. Imagine the top of a roller coaster just as it starts to go down and accelerate towards the ground. That you can imagine that as a very steep and fast curve. A slow curve is something closer to, say, almost flat. A slow curve would be a very subtle and quiet transition of values, but a fast curve would have a very rapid change in values, and that's what we're going to apply right now. So this little dark accent here is actually the form turning underneath of this bottom area of the rock iguana. So notice how quickly the values are descending from light to dark as we approach the bottom corner of this shape. And notice how in the light it's much the value transitions are much closer to one another because it's a slower curve. And so now we're painting in some of the little dark shapes directly to the right. And now we're going to move back to the little shape right here. So we're going to actually start to apply some of the texture on top of this three-dimensional round solid. So we're going in and applying the texture directly on top of it. So this mixture of paint has a little bit more Neo-Megilp. It has a little bit more medium to it. And if you want to create a consistency of paint where it feels like you're painting over top of a dry painting, then use less medium in your first layer, and this is how you work wet on wet. Notice how I'm applying wet paint over top of wet paint. This is known as wet on wet. Just use more medium as you apply the top layers, and it kind of sticks. So you kind of can feel the paint sticking onto the previous passage of paint. And basically, thinner paint will stick onto thicker paint. Think about it like putting the icing on the cake. The icing itself is not going to sink into the cake because it's lighter and it's much more fluffy, so to speak. So that's exactly what we're doing here. We're applying the icing onto the cake, really. And each individual brushstroke is giving us this little texture. Notice how there's going to be a very dispersed bit of texture here, and each tiny little brushstroke that we're applying is not to blend. So I'm not trying to soften the edges. Actually, I'm just trying to create the rugged type of scaly look that this amazing reptile has. And now talk about fast curve. Now notice how dramatically the value changes are. Notice how drastically these values are changing as we're moving from this dark shape into the lighter passage that we painted. This is also going to create a sharper edge. When you contrast a dark shape with a light shape, you inherently create the illusion of a sharper edge. And that's what we're trying to do here, actually. We're trying to create a sharper edge, but not quite as sharp as the outlines of the rock iguana. Now let's get into some more flat plane changes, flat plane overlays, if that's what you want to call it. So this little area of the iguana is kind of like a flat area, almost like a sheet. So this is almost literally a plane, and so this plane is facing the light a little bit more than the surrounding shape. So let's go in with some of the darker regions of the palette, and right next to it just paint in that darker shape. And remember, the darker colors are mixed up pretty much with ivory, black, raw umber, and a little bit of white, and pretty much just trying to create a lighter plane up against a dark plane and trying to get the pattern that I'm observing on the rock iguana. And so this shape needs to get a little bit darker here as the plane is turning even further away from the light. And now you can really tell how the application of value and our understanding of value on the painting is really starting to develop that illusion of a three-dimensional image on our panel. And so now you can really see the value scale on the palette. And again, I'm pretty much just mixing up a lot of the same value changes on my palette and just taking them directly from that. And just as a little test, to show you that it's pretty much the value that's creating a three-dimensional image, let's go ahead and distort the colors on this iguana. So now you're looking at a very colorful looking iguana, so an oversaturated iguana. And it still looks like a very three-dimensional image, even though we completely just distorted the colors with our editor. All right, let's switch back to the regular footage now. So now you can really tell that it's the application of value that's creating the feeling of a three-dimensional rock iguana that is just emerging out of the surface that we're painting on. Now let's get into the plane changes on this little bottom region of the rock iguana. So let's start off with that dark accent that we placed in there. And now let's just warm up this little region of halftone. So we used a little bit of our yellow ochre into that mixture just to get a little bit more warmth into the hue. Not really that much, just a tiny little bit there. And now we're going to change the value to give a different plane. So now this plane is angled closer to the light. And remember, the key word is the angle of the plane. So the angle of this plane is facing the light a little bit more. So this plane changes much closer to perpendicular to the light source. And remember, the darker planes are closer to parallel to the light source. And now we're painting in just a little continuation of this plane, but let's just add it a touch of ultramarine blue just to change up the hue a little bit. Sometimes when you're in the darker halftone regions of a painting, especially in a little corner like that, you can really sneak in some little tiny bits of color. So I threw in some ultramarine blue there, and now we're just going to get another plane change and pretty much just connect these two shapes and soften the little edges as we go. Again, you can also refer to the softening of the edges as just kind of like blending in one edge into another edge. There's nothing wrong with blending, so long as you're just softening the edges between your shapes, and that's all that I'm referring to with blending. So let's add in another little plane change here. So that plane is kind of in the middle. And so now through all these little value changes that we painted in that little triangular looking shape, you can now see that it's looking like a three-dimensional solid in contrast to the white of the panel that we're working on. And again, the white of the panel that we're working on is helping the darks look really dark. So it's really helping us get a nice contrast for the painting of this rock iguana. All right, so now let's move on to a different shape. So let's just paint the little dark barrier between these lighter shapes. So we're just painting in a dark plane that's separating the form of the side of the head from the torso of the rock iguana. So now we're going to start painting in some lighter planes as we approach the torso. Let's just paint in this little dark shape here. A little contrast between a dark shape and a light shape over here. And let's just soften that little corner right about there. So now let's switch to a bigger brush, and with a little bit more of our medium to thin out the paint, we're going to start to paint a larger area form. So this is now large form modeling. So we're starting to look at the little corner of the side of this rock iguana's neck. So this area, let's paint it as a darker shape, pretty much in the darker region of the palette, closer to the darker darks, but not quite as dark. Now we're going to contrast it with some lighter planes on the bottom. So that just means that these planes are facing the light a little bit more. So now we have a plane change, our very first plane change onto the neck. Now we're moving back to the other plane, so that is the darker shape. So all we have is a shape of dark and a shape of light, just two little half tones onto the neck. And you can already see how it's already starting to create an illusion of form just by having these two planes up against one another. And of course, softening the edges in between the two. And the way that I'm applying each individual brush stroke is I'm trying to pretty much pat it down in this kind of fashion so as to make the illusion of the scales. Remember, reptiles have a little bit of rougher texture, so we're trying to get the texture in there, but at the same time create the gradations of plane change as we move around the surface. So let's just get into the halftone, region of the palette, and let's add a little touch there of ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and then neutralize it a little bit with the raw umber. So now we have a lighter plane right about here, and this area is facing the light a little bit more. So we're just describing the journey that the forms are taking as they roll around the surface of this rock iguana, and as the forms are being influenced by the direction of the light. And now we have this little line right across the bottom here, and now we're going to put a little contrast with a little lighter plane on the edge right here, and this is how we're creating the little hills and valley of the rock iguana. Remember, there are multiple light sources in this image, but we're focusing on one particular angle of light to describe the form. Now, even though there are many different light sources, I'm only focusing on one primary light source to describe the pathways that the forms are taking as they angle closer or further away from the light. And again, we're describing the journey that these planes are making through our application of value. So notice that little dark shape that I just painted in there is a little facet of the rock iguana that's angling away from the light. That's why it's getting darker. And then these darker shapes here on the bottom, again, they're accents. They're conjunctions where one form meets another form and literally creates an overlap. And that overlap is described by a darker area of value. Now let's continue this little dark overlap. And another thing I should say is that I'm avoiding using straight black. I'm not using it at all. That's why you see me combine the ivory black with something like the raw umber or the ultramarine blue. I'm avoiding using straight black as much as I can, because something that's straight black is kind of hard. It's kind of hard to adjust your values when you have something straight black in there. So again, now we're moving further down the forms, and these shapes here are getting darker. And again, we're conceptualizing the forms. So I'm not really trying to copy what I'm looking at in front of me. Rather, I'm trying to interpret the forms as three-dimensional solids in space. And so now it's a little lighter as we turn away from this shape and a little darker as we approach the arm. And now let's just get into some lighter planes and just start to pat down the little surface. And I'm trying to apply these brush strokes again in a manner that is a little rugged and with hundreds of tiny little brush strokes to show the patchiness of the surface, of the texture of the surface. And so now we're just kind of mixing the dark and the lights all together to create the type of surface texture that we want. So again, mixing the darks and the lights directly onto this area of the painting to try and get the texture. We're using a lot of paint, as you notice on the palette, tons and tons of paint. That's why I like to use a transparent white, because I can use more of it without blowing up the value. Now you can do this with titanium white or any other type of opaque white if you want to, but it just takes more of the other pigments and less of the titanium white. Now let's make the planes a little bit lighter, closer to the shoulder region, and a little bit cooler with the ultramarine blue. Remember, we're throwing in some touches here and there of ultramarine blue closer to the lighter planes because, of course, the reptile is under the influence of a light bulb that mimics daylight and emits a specific light that they need to help them with their bodily functions. And remember, reptiles are cold-blooded, so they need to rely on the environment to help them regulate their temperatures. In any case, the light source that I'm describing is called a UVB light, and that light is cooler. That's why I'm using a little bit more of my ultramarine blue in these lighter mixtures. As you've just seen, I applied more ultramarine blue towards the lighter shapes, and then of course more white, just taking a ton of white into the ultramarine blue. Let's just throw in some little touches there. It's a little sharp edge for the little patches of the scale there to get the texture. I'm really trying to get the rock iguana texture there. Alright, so now we're on to the spikes, and let's paint in one spike in there, and let's magically let the other spikes show up. Now we have the other spikes, and so I think there's another one here, so one more little spike left. And I will say it is a lot of fun to paint an image of a reptile or any kind of animal really, but painting rock iguana, wow. It really does feel like I'm observing a living dinosaur. It really does. So now I'm painting in a little accent here for the bottom of the, I want to say armpit, but I don't think that that's the armpit. But that's the side of the arm as the muscle wraps around and approaches the torso of the rock iguana. And now we're moving our way in towards the dark lights of the arm. And these dark values are going to be the first values that I'm going to paint in there for the arm. And notice how we're going to develop the arms. So we started off with those very simple shapes, and those shapes became a little bit more specific as we got into the little digits of the outlines for the iguana's fingers. And now we're going to paint in. Now we've just painted in a little passage of value onto the arm. Now we're going to go ahead and paint another little passage of value. And so this passage is getting lighter because, of course, it's angled closer to the light and darker as it angles away. Now I'm conceptualizing this because it's kind of hard to see on the photo reference, so it's kind of hard to see on the rock iguana that these planes are getting darker as it turns away from the light. But conceptually, we know that it gets darker as it turns away from the light just by the nature of basically the roundness of the rock iguana's arm. And here's a little bottom for the elbow, little elbow joint right there, and a dark accent here for the bottom of the rock iguana's arm as it turns towards the bottom of the surface that the iguana is resting on. And now we have the little lighter planes closer to the back of the iguana's arm. And that iguana has a lot of spots. So we're using a very rough application of paint to suggest the roughness of the surface texture. But we're going to go back into that later and apply some little specks here and there of dark and light. So now we're moving our way closer and closer to the individual digits that the rock iguana has. But first, let's just paint this little lighter passage here. So remember, it's getting lighter because it's turning closer to the light, and darker because it's turning away, and that's pretty much the entire story, really. So lighter up here, we're just trying to even out this little plane change. And let's connect it towards the little dark digits here. And so this is going to be a local value change now. So now I'm going to start to paint darker, not because these planes are angled away from the light, but darker because the individual digits of the rock iguana are actually darker. They almost look like dark little gloves that the iguana is wearing, but these are actually the digits. So we're starting off with the bottom darkest area. Now, the bottom area that we painted first is actually facing away from the light. So if you noticed, we just painted another passage that is lighter. So we painted a lighter passage over top of a darker passage. But as a whole, the local value of the individual digits here are darker than the local values of the arms. And again, just a few simple little brush strokes in the approximately correct location should give us the effect of the actual digits or the hands that the rock iguana has. And we're going to leave some of these areas a little more unfinished, but what we do want to show is the actual plane changes in the actual structure. So let's go ahead and put the dark accent here on the bottom of the elbow, and now you see how we've created the forms for the arms. And again, you've just seen that in real time, so it's pretty cool how quickly we can create the illusion of form just by superimposing one value up against another value and just building from there. And now we're going to move on to the torso. So let's start off with the darker accent. So this little darker accent is the bottom of the torso of the rock iguana. And we're going to make it lighter as we move higher up. And a little bit lighter even more. So again, we're using a little tiny brush here just to try and get this plane change. But we will switch to a larger brush when we get towards the larger area of the torso of this rock iguana. Alright, so let's try to find the bottom of this little rock iguana's belly. So it's about there. I'm going to say it's right about there. So that's the accent. Remember, the accent is the conjunction between two forms. So that is the form of the belly of the rock iguana and the surface that the rock iguana is sitting on, creating that dark accent. And now we're just going to go in with the small little brush strokes here and delineate the plane changes as the belly is turning away further and further and further away from the light just as it goes beneath the surface. And that's the transition value that we want to create with the smaller brush. And now we're going to switch to a larger brush. So this brush that we're going to have right about here is going to be a size 4 filbert brush. So this is a size 4 filbert brush. And again, if you want to know exactly what brushes I'm using and oil paints and all of that, that information is typed up for you in the description box below. Alright, so with this brush, we're going to spread the oil paint over the surface using more of our medium. So again, using more of our Neo-Megilp medium. And we're going to go ahead and just disperse the paint onto the surface. And this is pretty much a dark shape that we're observing here. And it's not really that evident on the photo reference. So what we're doing is we're taking the information in front of us and we're composing with it, not copying it. We're trying to design with what we were given and not copy. So let's go ahead and paint in a lighter plane right about here. And just follow along with the brush. As you can see that we're creating darker planes here and lighter planes to create the illusion of the form for this rock iguana. And I'm not trying to put in so much detail or so many little bits of information individually. Rather, I'm letting the brush strokes do some of the work for me. Notice this little rugged, scrubby application of oil paint. This is how we're going to create the kind of illusion of the texture of the surface of the rock iguana. So now we just painted in a little top portion for the side of the rock iguana. And right about here on the back side, this is actually turning away from us in perspective. So it would be actually getting smaller and smaller, but instead we're just going to keep it kind of cropped in that type of fashion. I just wanted to crop the rock iguana in this type of design. And let's go ahead and just make some more little texture with the brush strokes. Alright, so now let's move on to the details or the spots for the arm. First, let's paint in a little accent here. So another little dark accent just to reinforce one form meeting up against another form. And now let's go in and make individual little spots, individual little brush strokes, and then cover those individual little brush strokes with light applications of paint. And let's just put a tiny little bit here for the arm. Very tiny little touches of paint here. Don't need much. I just want it to read its best at a distance. Little tiny touches right there. I don't want to put too much, just a tiny little speck there. Alright, so now let's put in a little bit more information onto the scales or the rock-like structure with a bold, brave brushstroke of light tapping the paint right onto the surface, creating a sharper edge. And pretty much just that act alone of applying a sharper and lighter shape here will give us the illusion of the three-dimensionality of the rock iguana. And there you have it. That is the conclusion of this oil painting video of a rock iguana. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that these videos are helping you out. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.